The female reproductive cycle is going to be pretty challenging. It's always challenging when there's hormones involved, and there's a number of different hormones, and sometimes a hormone goes up and that causes something to occur, and then sometimes that hormone will go down and that causes something else to occur. So female reproductive cycle is going to challenge you, all right, but you're at the end of AMP2, and I believe everyone can get to the point where it'll make sense. Now we're going to first introduce the hormones on this slide. We'll touch on a few of the things they do, but then we have to put it all together, and we're going to go through what's known as the female reproductive cycle, which is about a 28-day cycle. All right, so notice at the top, it all starts at the hypothalamus, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That gets produced at puberty and stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce FSH and LH. FSH is going to basically tell you what it does. All right, it's going to stimulate the initial development of the follicles and then further development of the follicles. All right, now, one thing we got to remember is that you don't just keep developing follicles throughout a whole cycle. After ovulation, you want to stop developing follicles, right? Because we have to see what happens to the ovulated egg. We don't keep developing more and more follicles and keep ovulating more and more eggs. So FSH then needs to be relatively high until ovulation. Then after ovulation, you need FSH to go down low because you don't want more follicles to mature. All right. LH. LH does two main things. One is it's the trigger for ovulation. So FSH gets the follicle to that mature stage, but it doesn't cause the ovulation. You have to have a spike in LH. So LH levels go really high, and that triggers the ovulation. Then you also need that LH to help stimulate the formation of the corpus luteum. Remember, the corpus luteum is that empty follicle that collapses inward and kind of turns this yellow color. And then notice what the corpus luteum does. It secretes large amounts of progesterone, estrogen, relaxin, and inhibin. So whenever you have a corpus luteum, those four hormones are going to be relatively high. Now notice, when will those be high? Well, they're high after ovulation, because that's when the corpus luteum forms. All right? Okay, so then we can talk about what those four hormones do. Estrogen does a lot of what testosterone does for a male. So it's going to promote the maintenance of the female reproductive structures, feminine secondary sex characteristics, formation of breast tissue. It does stimulate some anabolism. It's been found to lower blood cholesterol. That's kind of just an added benefit, I guess, to having estrogen, is it keeps cholesterol levels low. And then really important concept in female reproduction is negative feedback. So if estrogen levels are high, they're going to inhibit the gonadotropins. So it inhibits the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, FSH, and LH. And that should kind of make sense, because remember, the FSH and LH are high before ovulation. We want them to go low after ovulation. So it's the production of estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin which cause FSH and LH to go low after ovulation. All right, and we'll revisit that concept a couple times. Progesterone works with estrogen to prepare the endometrium for implantation. So that endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus where the embryo has to attach. So estrogen and progesterone kind of get that uterine lining, the endometrium, ready for that implantation. It also helps prepare the mammary glands. And then again, it's got this negative feedback effect on GnRH and LH. Relaxin was named relaxin because that's what it does. It relaxes certain things. One thing it relaxes is the muscle of the uterus, so it can start to expand if there's a pregnancy, if there's an embryo and then a fetus inside the uterus. And then during labor, it actually relaxes the pubic symphysis and increases the flexibility. So that'll help widen the birth canal. And then it also dilates or relaxes the cervix during delivery. And then inhibin is just inhibitory. So when this inhibin is getting produced, it helps to keep FSH low. All right. All right, so that just introduces the hormones. This is kind of our start to really working out where the hormones are high or low and what that does. So what I did here is in the center are the 28 days. All right, so a normal female reproductive cycle is roughly 28 days. Now, that's not true for everyone. That's typically what we use to teach it, all right, because that's kind of the average length. It can be longer, it can be shorter, but we're going to use 28 days. Certain days are of importance. So, for example, day 5, because 0, or I should say day 1 to day 5, is the menstrual phase in the uterus. Day 5 to 14 is the proliferative phase in the uterus. And then 14 to 28 is called the secretory phase. So when we're looking at the uterus, there's 3 phases during the cycle. When we're looking at the ovary, there's basically 3 phases as well. We have ovulation, so this O represents ovulation. That's roughly day 14. Before ovulation, we call it the follicular phase, because that's what we're doing. We're maturing follicles. We're trying to get that mature follicle ready. And then after ovulation is the luteal phase, because we have the corpus luteum producing hormones. All right? So when we study the female reproductive cycle, we have to separate it into the ovarian cycle, so what's happening in the ovary, and the uterine cycle, what's happening in the uterus. And this just gives us the names of these phases. Now you'll also notice that down here are the hormones. So this is the problem, right? We got hormones going up, going down. What do those hormones do when they're high? What do they do when they're low? So notice that in the beginning of the cycle, all right, we have relatively high FSH, relatively high LH. It's not super low like down here at day 20 some. So those 2 hormones are relatively high, FSH and LH. What is that FSH doing? Well, it's causing this follicular phase, right? It's maturing the follicles. Now notice what's low. We have low estrogen and low progesterone. What are the low estrogen and progesterone causing? They're actually causing menstruation. All right, so menstruation is due to low estrogen and low progesterone levels. All right, and menstruation lasts roughly 5 days, and then all of a sudden you'll notice the estrogen starts to go up, and that estrogen is really important for the proliferative phase. That's basically reforming the endometrium. Then we lead up to that big day of ovulation. All right, and notice what has to happen for ovulation to occur. We need a spike in LH. All right, and that spike in LH triggers ovulation. Then what happens? Well, we have corpus luteum form. All right, and when the corpus luteum forms, we see an increase in progesterone. We see an increase in estrogen. This diagram doesn't show the relaxin and inhibin, but they go up as well. Now remember the negative feedback. When estrogen goes up and progesterone goes up during this post-ovulation period, that lowers the FSH and LH. So we don't want FSH and LH after ovulation because we have to see what happens to this ovulated egg. Okay? All right, so that introduces kind of the phases, the ovarian, uterine cycle and the hormones. We're going to go nice and slowly through the 28-day cycle. All right, so we start with menstrual phase. Okay, so the menstrual phase describes what's happening in the uterus. In the ovary, we're going to be in the follicular phase. All right, so basically, day 1 is the first sign of menstruation. Okay, so menstruation is when the endometrium lining dies. All right, and when it dies, it kind of sloughs off. So there's a layer of cells and blood that gets removed from the endometrium. All right, so that first sign sets the new cycle. What's going to be happening in the ovary? Well, we're going to start a follicular phase. So we're going to have FSH stimulating follicular development. And we'll probably get a secondary follicle form during this menstrual phase. All right. What's happening in the uterus? Low estrogen, low progesterone are going to stimulate the uterine arterioles to constrict. So basically, it closes off the blood flow to the endometrium. And the outer layer of the endometrium, known as the stratum functionalis, is what gets removed. All right, so that gets removed, and that's what menstruation is. Now, underneath it, there's another layer of the endometrium called the stratum basalis. It's going to stay because we have to reform the stratum functionalis. All right, so that's the first 5 days. The next week or so, so day 6 to 13, we're still in the follicular phase in the ovary, but we've formed the mature follicle. All right, the mature follicle, also called the Graafian follicle, is going to be the one to ovulate. All right, so that forms again in between, day 5 and up to maybe day 10 or so. We have this mature follicle form. Now, what happens is the mature follicle starts to produce hormones. So we see an increase in estrogen levels during this late follicular phase in the ovary. And it produces estrogen and inhibin, and that's going to help to decrease the FSH levels, right? Remember, we have a follicle, all right? The goal of an ovary during a cycle is to get one follicle formed, all right, and then eventually get it to ovulate. Once we have one formed, we don't want to form more follicles. So we have to decrease the FSH to stop follicles from maturing because we have one, all right? So we have the mature follicle. What's going to be happening in the uterus? Well, we have to reform that stratum functionalis. That's called the proliferative phase. And the key hormone that's going to be doing that is estrogen. So the estrogen from the mature follicle causes a decrease in FSH, and it stimulates the endometrium. All right, and because it's stimulating the endometrium, we call this phase in the uterus the proliferative phase. All right, so now we're getting to the big day. All right, the big day is going to be day 14. Before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the two different types of twins. Fraternal twins or non-identical twins are going to be when we have codominant follicles. So we basically have two of these. We have two mature follicles. They're both going to ovulate, and they both can be fertilized. But they get fertilized by different sperm. So the two eggs that were ovulated are genetically different. The two sperm cells are genetically different. So the two embryos are going to be genetically different, all right? Non-identical or fraternal twins. We often call that dizygotic because we form two separate zygotes from two separate eggs and two separate sperm. Maternal or identical twins, you only have one ovulated egg. It gets fertilized by one sperm, but the embryo splits. So it started as one embryo, so we call it monozygotic, but it splits into two. And those two, since they came from the same egg and sperm, are identical. Okay, so now we're on to the big day, day 14. What happens? Well, the high estrogen from the mature follicle, all of a sudden, because it gets to a certain level, it switches to, instead of a negative feedback, it goes positive feedback. And it's positive feedback for LH. So notice here's this mature follicle. It's producing estrogen, right? And we learned that, okay, the estrogen is going to cause FSH to go down. The estrogen causes the proliferation of the endometrium. But all of a sudden it reaches a point where it actually stimulates more LH production. So it's a way to tell the anterior pituitary, you have to make LH because I'm dying to ovulate here. All right, I'm ready. I'm mature. I'm off to the surface of the ovary. All I got to do is rupture so I can release that secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. But I need LH. So the high estrogen causes high LH, and that triggers ovulation. All right, and you can test for LH levels. There's ovulation kits that you can test to see if the LH levels are really high, because if they're really high, you're either about to ovulate or you just ovulated. So now that oocyte enters the fallopian tube. So now what happens? Well, we're in this post-ovulatory phase, right? Ovulation happens. What's going to happen after? And it largely depends on if there's fertilization or not. But we have to always plan that it might happen. So the empty follicle collapses inward and forms the corpus luteum. So in the ovary, we call this phase the luteal phase, all right? Because the corpus luteum is basically in charge of things now. It's producing progesterone, which we haven't seen yet. We're producing estrogen again. We're producing relaxin and inhibin. And together, those four hormones work together to prepare for pregnancy. All right. Now, if we want pregnancy not to proceed, there are medications that block progesterone. All right. So those are abortion medications. So progesterone is a required hormone for pregnancy. But abortions are going to be able to be induced by blocking progesterone. We'll talk about birth control in a little bit. All right, so now what's happening in the uterus? Well, we enter what's called the secretory phase. So we go from the proliferative phase, where it was just being stimulated by estrogen, to the secretory phase, where it's being stimulated by both estrogen and progesterone. And that's really going to get that endometrium ready for implantation. All right, so now we've got two options. Either no fertilization or fertilization. So let's first look at what happens if fertilization does not occur. So no sperm in the fallopian tube, all right? And the corpus luteum's producing these hormones, but it's kind of waiting to find out. Corpus luteum is in charge, but it needs to find out if there's an embryo or not, all right? And we're going to see that how it finds out is the embryo has to make a hormone. So the corpus luteum is sitting there waiting for this hormone. All right, there's a hormone that needs to be produced by the embryo to notify the corpus luteum that pregnancy happened. But in this case, it never arrives. This hormone never gets made because there's no fertilization and there's no embryo. So eventually the corpus luteum kind of gives up. All right, it says, all right, must not be a pregnancy, because I haven't seen this embryonic hormone. So I'm just going to stop doing my thing. I'm going to degenerate into the corpus albicans, and I'm going to stop making estrogen, progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin. And because those hormones go down, it lifts that negative feedback off, and you start to produce FSH and LH again. And that's going to bring us into a new cycle. And if you remember, that first menstrual phase was when there was low estrogen and low progesterone, but high FSH. So we're right back to that beginning again. So we start again at day 1. We enter a new follicular phase and a new menstrual phase. What causes the follicular phase? FSH production. What triggers menstruation? Low estrogen and low progesterone. If you think about it, estrogen and progesterone stimulate the endometrium, right? Estrogen stimulates the proliferation, and then they both stimulate the secretory phase. So those two hormones are stimulating the endometrium. If they drop, it makes sense that the endometrium now will die, and that is what menstruation is. All right, so we just start all over again. What happens if pregnancy or fertilization does occur? Well, remember, it occurs in the uterine tube, all right, where sperm meets oocyte, forms the diploid zygote, all right. That diploid zygote becomes the embryo, right? And that embryo has to eventually implant in the uterus. That takes about 6 days after fertilization. So this is a waiting game, right? That corpus luteum is sitting there waiting. After 6 days, it implants in the uterus. 2 days later, it produces HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. That's the hormone that tells the corpus luteum there's an embryo. So you need to keep doing your thing. So HCG stimulates the corpus luteum to remain and continue to produce progesterone, estrogen, relaxin, and inhibin. And that progresses and promotes the pregnancy. All right, the high estrogen and the high inhibin keep the gonadotropins down, right? Because we definitely don't want to keep maturing follicles because we're pregnant. We reached the goal. So low gonadotropin releasing hormone, low FSH, low LH. These are going to prevent further follicular maturation and prevent any ovulation. The high estrogen and progesterone are going to stimulate the growth of the endometrium so it can nourish and supply blood to that implanted embryo. And then that embryo grows, becomes a fetus, and pregnancy hopefully ends very successfully. All right? Okay. This is a picture showing some of those early stages. We're not going to do much development, but just the first, couple weeks here. So notice that we have ovulation. There we have fertilization, a whole bunch of sperm there, but only one of them is going to fertilize. All right. And that fertilization occurs typically, within a day after ovulation. Then we have the formation of the diploid zygote. All right. Then it starts to divide by mitosis. And that diploid zygote, notice it became 2 cells, then it becomes 4 cells, and then it becomes 8 cells, and then 16 cells. Those early rounds of mitosis are known as cleavage because the cells are getting smaller but more numerous. So the embryo doesn't get much bigger. It's just the number of cells go up. But the size of those cells is smaller. Then it reaches about 3 to 4 days after fertilization. It's known as the morula. A morula is kind of a solid ball of cells, just a bunch of these stem cells, embryonic stem cells. Then it enters the uterus as what's called the blastocyst. So now we're about 5 days after fertilization. And then notice right here, it implants roughly 6 days after fertilization. Then it takes a couple days to make that hormone, because remember, the hormone has to go into the bloodstream. So it has to somehow secrete the hormone into the bloodstream in order to tell the ovary that pregnancy happened. It just so happens we can find out if pregnancy happened by testing for HCG. So that's the target of home pregnancy tests. Okay, we're going to start a new video on this slide. This is my very favorite slide in AMP2, and it's going to review everything we just did on the previous 5-6 slides, but it's going to all be in one slide. So I want to do this one all by itself in its own video.